Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and we start out here in the direction of Ocheretyne, where the Russians continue their offensive operations and have managed to gain a foothold in the southern outskirts of the village. This is confirmed with this geolocated footage showing the results of a Russian armored vehicle driving up to the village, dropping off its infantry that then takes up positions in the houses in the outskirts of the village. In the previous few days, the Russians have restarted offensive operations in the direction of this village, where we now see the effects of that. We then move on to the next section of the front line in the direction of Krasnohorivka, where there has been significant developments. The Russians have captured the westernmost parts of the fortifications in the central parts of the city, as well as the first buildings in the industrial zone. This means that the Russians have now entered the most fortified area of Krasnohorivka, and the fighting here will be very intense as Russians will attempt to capture the industrial area within the city, forcing the Ukrainians back into the residential area of the city, which is very difficult to defend in comparison. At the same time, the Russians have managed to push the Ukrainians completely out of the residential area in the southern outskirts of the city, leaving only the areas here on the outskirts and the western outskirts of the city under Ukrainian control. The rest under Russian control means that the Russians have now secured the southern supply lines completely, and it will now allow the Russians to concentrate a larger force within the city to continue these offensive operations, both in the direction of the industrial zone and the fortifications in the central parts of the city. This means that the Battle of Krasnohorivka is entering a new stage where the main battle is taking place. What follows will be a clearing of the rest of the city with no significant fights comparable to the fighting over the industrial and fortified areas of Krasnohorivka. This means that the Ukrainian forces remaining in the city that were pushed back from the industrial zone would be forced to withdraw, a slow withdrawal from the city. The city itself is isolated. This means that there are two possibilities for the Russian capture of the city. The first one is that the Russians capture the central parts and the industrial zone, the fortifications there, and the Ukrainians withdraw from the city, leaving the remaining parts under a gray zone before the Russians take control of them, and they try to save their lives by withdrawing back to the next line of defense, which is here to the west of the city, from Karelivka in the north and down to Maximilianivka in the south. The second possibility is that the Russians continue pushing and capture the central parts, and the Ukrainians remain in the residential areas and continue fighting with no withdrawals, ending up either them surrendering or fighting to their last breath. That is the kind of situation Krasnohorivka is, considering how far it is between any other positions and fortifications, leaving the Ukrainian soldiers within the city extremely vulnerable in case of a withdrawal. This is why it's very important for the Ukrainians to hold on to their positions prior to a Russian foothold. But with this Russian foothold and control over the southern parts of the city, it is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control of it and the Ukrainians are forced to withdraw or fight until their last breath or surrender. And we have exclusive breaking news from Syriac Maps. The Russians have managed to push through the central parts of the fortifications in the central parts of the city to reach the gas station here and the central eastern parts of the city and the central roads of the city. With this, the Russians have broken through the Ukrainian fortifications within the center of the city. The Russians are fighting heavily over the industrial zone. This means that the Ukrainians are very, very difficult situation within Krasnohorivka, as the Russians simply have control over the most important fortification of the city. As I just mentioned, the northern parts of the residential area of Krasnohorivka is very difficult to hold on to, especially with heavy artillery fire and FAB bombs by the Russians. This means that the current position of the Ukrainians within the city is to hold on to the few high-rise buildings there are in the central parts and eastern parts of the city. Other than that, they would have lost the city and will be forced to go with one of the three options that are available for them with the isolation of the city itself. The significance of Krasnohorivka is that it is in close proximity to Donetsk, similar to Avdiivka. It's a bit further away, but with the Ukrainian control over the city, they were able to launch shells towards the districts of Donetsk and towards the western outskirts of the city. If the Russians gain full control of it, this will stop. At the same time, with control of both Pervomaiske, Nevelske, and Krasnohorivka, the Russians would push the front line towards the next line of defense here to the west of Donetsk, clearing a major buffer zone. Together with the major buffer zone that is being created in the north of Avdiivka, we would see that the Russians would gain full control over this whole area, creating a massive buffer zone between the locations here of the west of Donetsk, from Prihorivka to the south and to Ocheretyne in the north. This will allow the Russians to use Donetsk city completely freely for supplies and organizing their army, meaning that they could start and orchestrate an offensive towards Pokrovsk. In that sense, we see here in the direction of Ocheretyne, the Russian advances do not stop. They now have almost full control of the entirety of Ocheretyne, with just the northeastern outskirts remaining in the Ukrainian hands. The majority of the fortifications around Ocheretyne have now been physically captured by the Russians. There's also this advance towards Solovyove, which has been geolocated with this footage here showing a Russian foothold within the village. It is also likely that the Russians move from the northern direction and Novobakhmutivka, getting control over the fortifications in the north and moving to the eastern parts of the village. The Russians will likely continue pushing to gain full control of the village, which will leave this northern parts south of Ocheretyne under Russian control. Securing to the southern flank, which is the closest proximity to Ocheretyne, the Russians have now full control of and very secure control of Ocheretyne and the heights and fortifications surrounding it. With this, the Russians would be able to launch further operations towards Sokil and other villages here to the west of Ocheretyne. To give a clearer overview of exactly how this would happen, it is clear with the control of the Russians here west of Ocheretyne, they'll likely continue moving west of the railways, similar to how they entered Ocheretyne in the first place. This will mean that the Russians would be able to push in the northern direction towards the fortifications there, and in the southern direction to have their positions here north of Sokil, where fighting will take place over the fortifications north of the village. The fortifications to the north of the village are located in the high ground. However, what is located even above that is the Russian positions by the railways, which would move through fighting over the fortifications and then have an overlook location of the fortifications north of Sokil, with a combination of strikes directly through the road by Solokyove towards Sokil will allow the Russians to attack it in a pincer maneuver with the high ground advantage and rush towards Sokil to gain control of that village as well. So we're seeing constant advances by the Russians and a significant advantageous gains by capture of Ocheretyne, allowing the Russians to have a significant advantage in this section of the front line and allowing the Russians to subsequently have a much stronger push towards the Ukrainian positions. At this rate, we are seeing a collapse of the Ukrainian front line with the advances by the Russians within Krasnohorivka and Ocheretyne, which are significant defensive positions of the Ukrainians. They have very few positions in this section of the front line, similar to these cities and villages, yet the Ukrainians have been unable to hold on to these. The casualties the Ukrainians will be receiving and the difficulty of the battles will significantly increase going forward. And this means that the Russians would have more success and the Ukrainians would have more difficulties and defeats in the coming weeks and months. This is especially true with this article by the Financial Post talking about how Ukraine is still outgunned by Russia and will continue to do so. It is reported by US officials, according to this article, claim that the United States will focus on filling up its own stockpiles of ammunition and weapons before they start sending to Ukraine. By that, it is reported in this article that the United States will not send any significant portion of artillery shells or other munitions and equipment or weaponry to Ukraine prior to 2025. So for the rest of the year and a few months into 2025 as well, before they start receiving artillery shells in large numbers. The article claims that the Ukrainians will be forced to continue their usage of about 2,000 to 2,500 shells a day for the rest of the year and for the next 12 months combined. This means that the Ukrainians will continue to be outgunned 5-1 or 10-1 if a Russian offensive starts. This could be subject to change depending on the situation on the ground. If a rapid collapse is happening, the United States may speed up the process of delivering artillery shells and other munitions to Ukraine, as it is extremely important for them and their survival. It has just been reported that the Russians have also started fighting towards the village of Arkhangelsk here to the north, where they've entered the outskirts of the village that is separated from the village itself. This means further offensive operations are continuing in the northern direction. This exactly shows the advantages of Ocheretyne, located on the high grounds both to the north, south, west, and east. This means that the Russians moving through towards Arkhangelsk will have the high ground in that direction as well. This is showing the continuous disaster of the front line of the Ukrainians right now. The next defensive lines are inconceivably weaker than what we have seen so far. The Avdiivka and Krasnoyarivka directions are much tougher than what follows, and this is where we're seeing that the Russians have simply completely destroyed the Ukrainian positions in Krasnoyarivka and Avdiivka, allowing them to continuously push beyond. And the Ukrainian elite brigades are completely exhausted from all of the fighting. Despite the 47th Mechanized Brigades being sent to Ocheretyne, counterattacking to try and regain positions, Ocheretyne has fallen and the Russians have captured it. This shows that the 47th Mechanized Brigade is unable to put a stop or even delay the Russian advances as the Ukrainian lines are completely collapsing. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.